very nice of you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, David, for those kind remarks. First, I'd like to thank very much Paul Greenhalgh and his committee who have organized just a wonderful meeting here with so many people and so many distinguished speakers. This is where I'm from, Madison, Wisconsin, the capital of the state of Wisconsin. See the Capitol building here. It's located on an isthmus here. The University of Wisconsin runs along one of the 4 lakes around the city. And the beautiful thing about this is it looks like this 365 days of the year. You see, if I don't get a response from the audience, when I know I'm in trouble the rest of the time. I'm very honored to accept this award named after 2 giants in the field of physiology. And I'll accept this on behalf of the pre- and postdoctoral fellows and faculty of the John Rankin Laboratory. And these are a list of the people over this very long period of time that I've had the great honor of working with. I'm especially pleased that some of them are here today. Mary Morell is a postdoctoral fellow, and she's practicing here in London in the sleep apnea field. Lee Romer is here at Brunel University, diaphragm fatigue guy, got our lab going on that. And of course, Marcus Amann, who you heard give that wonderful lecture this morning, and a faculty colleague and an extremely close friend of mine, Barbara Morgan, who has helped train many of these people. And so I'm very pleased that they're here today to share this with me. Of course, these gentlemen are known, I think, to all of you. They're pioneers in endocrinology and in cardiovascular physiology. There was a rumor going around about half an hour ago that Banks Saltina and I were students of these people. I want to dispel that notion immediately, perhaps of their grandsons or daughters. But I'm very familiar with some of the people who have given this lecture before, or relatives of them. These are 2 real giants that I've learned so much from. Michael de Berg-Daly, whose father gave this lecture in the 60s, and his work on the cardiorespiratory interactions is just a wonderful. Read his chapter in the Handbook of Physiology from the 80s if you've got about 2 weeks to read it. I mean, it's just a wonderful lifetime of work on how these 2 organs interact. And much of our work on this during exercise is based on, and you heard some of it this morning, is based on his pioneering work. And I had a chance to interact with him extensively, with John Pappenheimer, who I knew very well from Harvard, who did a lot of work on the central chemoreceptors and led many of us who came after him to emulate his work. And I particularly want to take this opportunity to honor Brian Whipp, who has passed away recently. Sue Ward is here. I'm so glad you're here, Susan. Brian and I are contemporaries, and we both very interested in the regulation of breathing in many states. And we would meet yearly, starting in the 60s at the annual FASB meeting in Atlantic City, and discuss our findings. We rarely agreed. I learned so much from Brian over this period of time. We usually had a game of squash every time we played. I never got even close to beating him, but we had some wonderful times together, and these are great memories. We miss him a great deal. This is what I'd like to talk to you about, a little different change of tack, some new perspectives on the role of feedback in regulating the heart and the lung and the respiratory muscles during exercise. I want to talk about 2 problems in the field. One is, why do we breathe more when we exercise? The tenets for this were established in Germany and Scandinavia in the 1880s and 90s. We've stuck with the same ideas pretty well since then. and I'd like to at least give you our laboratory's take on part of this major mystery. And the other part is the regulation of blood flow distribution during exercise. Here's cardiac output increasing here from Larry Rowell's figure with increasing exercise, and how cardiac output increases linearly, and then blood flow is redistributed primarily to skeletal muscle. So let's start on this side with blood flow distribution and the factors that regulate it. And I'm mainly concerned with feedback factors. So here's our diagram again, and what I've added to this is our realization that just isn't just locomotor muscles that's receiving this, but this distribution between locomotor and respiratory muscles. That's been our emphasis in our lab. And so what are the sources of exercise-induced sympathetic and parasympathetic regulation during exercise? Well, we know there are many. I'm not going to talk about central command, but it's certainly a key factor in regulating sympathetic and parasympathetic regulation during exercise. This has been shown very beautifully in animal models. In fact, if the brain is stimulated, motor areas of the brain are stimulated, as Fred Eldridge and his colleagues showed over 30 years ago now, in a beautiful preparation in the cat. The blood pressure and heart rate and ventilation all rise just as if and even if you paralyze the muscles and get rid of all this kind of feedback, the response just based on central command alone looks like the intact animal. So these are obviously very important. And while very difficult to study in the human, in the last decade or so, there have been some very nice studies, including some from David Patterson's lab, with direct recording, neural recordings from motor areas of the brain in the human, and combined with imaging techniques to look at blood flow distribution. So I think this is getting on a pretty firm footing now, even in the human, as an important mechanism. One of the three areas that we study in our lab have been limb muscle afferents, which I'll talk about second here, respiratory muscle afferents, and carotid chemoreceptors. Well, I'm just going to talk to you about two of them, limb muscle and carotid chemoreceptors. Marcus did a beautiful job this morning of describing to you the role of respiratory muscle afferents. The only thing I would add to this is Marcus talked about the normal human, healthy human, in how afferents from the respiratory muscle are so important in regulating the distribution of blood flow between locomotor and respiratory muscles. Now some other laboratories, including some former students from our lab, have now been studying this in the heart failure patient and in patients with COPD. And these receptors are extremely sensitive and play an even more important role in regulating distribution of blood flow in these patients. So I'll leave that for the moment. The one I'd like to talk to you about is one that we really don't think of a role for this in cardiovascular role, but we think it has a very important cardiovascular role, even under normal oxygen environment in healthy people during exercise. So let's talk about that a little bit. Well, here's this remarkable, we think of as remarkable carotid chemoreceptor. And this is Nobel laureate Cornelia Heymans from Belgium, who won the Nobel Prize in 1938 for really describing the function of the carotid chemoreceptor. And you can see here in the cat, the heart is here, the brain is here. You can see this 1 millimeter diameter, extremely highly vascularized carotid chemoreceptor. Here's the sensory nerve, the carotid sinus nerve, here going to the nucleus of the solitary tract and then on to medullary neurons that generate the rhythm for breathing. We found out a lot about the carotid chemoreceptor in the past 15 years, that it's not just an oxygen sensor and it just doesn't regulate breathing. It's got a lot more than that. Here are some of the newer things, and this is just a partial list now, of the different stimuli that can cause this sensory nerve traffic to increase when stimulating the carotid chemoreceptor. Glucose regulation is particularly interesting, especially during exercise, and this may, very preliminary evidence, but may be starting to play a major role. It does more than just regulate breathing. It's a major effector of sympathetic nerve activity and vasoconstriction. So, and we'll be concentrating on that in this talk now. We also know, this is some data from our lab that Gregory Blaine was responsible for, that when we stimulate this carotid chemoreceptor, it also has an effect on another set of chemoreceptors in the brain, and it greatly increases or affects the gain of the central chemoreceptors. So it does more than just act alone. And another thing that we've learned now in the last decade or two is that this is a highly plastic body. Even after, for example, 2 hours of exposure to hypoxia, the sensitivity of this carotid chemoreceptor doubles and explains much of the increase in ventilation and sympathetic nerve activity that we see over time in a hypoxic environment. I'm going to give an example of that today, how this changes in the heart failure animal. So, does lots of things, senses lots of things, and performs some pretty key functions, and is responsive to change. So here's the question we asked with the carotid chemoreceptor and exercise. Does the normal tonic activity of this receptor affect sympathetic nerve activity and cardiovascular regulation under these different conditions, including in the heart failure animal? How do we study this? Well, it's very difficult to get at. We can denervate it, and there's lots of information available in the last 40 years on the effects of bilateral carotid body denervation. The problem with this is when you denervate the carotid chemoreceptors, you're usually denervating the baroreceptors at the same time, so that's a major factor if you're going to study cardiovascular regulation. But even an equally great problem is that probably within a very short period of time after denervating these receptors, the rest of the regulatory system changes. So now aortic chemoreceptors upregulate their role. They really play very little role as a chemoreceptors, but now they become important. And even centrally, at the level of integration, things start to change. So you no longer have a normal control system. So while this is a very handy experiment to do, to test some, trying to assess the normal role of the carotid chemoreceptor, it's hard to do when you change it from normal. We could give the animal oxygen to breathe. And that's what we've done in some cases that I'm going to show you. You can't study this in the steady state, however, because if oxygen is around longer than a minute or two, then the central nervous system responds to this in a stimulatory role. So steady state isn't good. So this is what we've concentrated on, transient inhibition of the carotid body under normal conditions. So this is one. I'll start with a set of experiments in an animal model and then go to 2 other experiments in the human. We use the dog. The dog loves to please people, the dog loves to exercise, and the dog loves to sleep. And those are the conditions that we study. So this is a little diagram here of the common carotid artery, its bifurcation, and here's our receptor of interest at the carotid chemoreceptor right here. So Michael Sticklin, when he was a postdoc, inserted a catheter right where the tip was right at the bifurcation of the common carotid, right at the bottom of the location of the carotid chemoreceptor. And we could use infusion of dopamine transiently and of hyperoxic saline. Both of these agents have been shown to completely inhibit carotid sinus nerve activity. So this was our idea, to get the animal at rest or exercise or in heart failure, where we know carotid chemoreceptor sensitivity is greatly upregulated, and to take whatever activity was there under the rest or exercise conditions and inhibit it and see what effect it had on cardiovascular function. So let me show you one example of this, and we had these animals with multiple flow probes on the ascending aorta for cardiac output, on the hind limbs, on the mesenteric vasculature, on the renal vasculature to study blood flow distribution. So here's one example here. Here's time during mild exercise for the animal. I say mild, there's no increase in circulating lactic acid, the pH is normal, CO2 and oxygen are normal. Here's cardiac output on a beat-by-beat basis. Here's hind limb blood flow, hind limb conductance, and blood pressure. And you can see when this transient inhibition of the carotid chemoreceptor, what happened? You can see cardiac output change, hind limb blood flow immediately went up when we inhibited the carotid chemoreceptor, hind limb conductance increased substantially, and blood pressure fell transiently. And this happened over and over again every time we did this. We did it at different doses. So to test whether this was truly a carotid body effect when we did this, we denervated the carotid bodies, and this effect went away. We gave an alpha blockade to block ganglionic blockade, and this effect went away. So we're pretty sure this is a reflex effect from the carotid chemoreceptor. Then we asked the question, what's the relative contribution of this so-called tonic activity coming from the carotid body to sympathetically mediated vascular constraint? What's its relative importance? Rest and exercise, and in a model of heart failure in the dog. Here's an example in the healthy animal first, and I just noted it with an ejection fraction of 55% for this animal. So here we define the maximum percent change in hind limb vascular conductance. First at rest. If we did systemic alpha blockade, that's total blockade with phentolamine, you can see we've got some tonic sympathetic activity here, and that vascular conductance increased about 50% from its resting value. If in the intact animal we just inhibited the carotid chemoreceptors, there was no contribution. So in the resting normal animal, the carotid chemoreceptor was contributing nothing really to the tonic sympathetic activity to the hind limb. Then with mild exercise, you can see this substantial increase, almost a threefold increase in the change in conductance when we did the total alpha blockade. And now, in the healthy animal, the chemoreceptor plays a significant role. About a little over 30% of the total change in conductance due to sympathetic tone can be explained by input from the carotid body. So it's a significant amount. It's not paltry. It's a significant amount. What happens then if we took this animal and paced him for several weeks, paced his heart at very high rate to cause heart failure, a traditional model that's used to cause this? And so now we have an animal that has two major things that have changed. Now the ejection fraction is no longer in the mid-50s, it's closer to 20%. So we've got true heart failure, big dilated left ventricle in this animal. And when we measure the ventilatory response to hypoxia, it's increased about 3 times. This has been established in the last 10 years, especially with the work of Harold Schwartz from the University of Nebraska, that one of the major changes that's occurring with heart failure, there's a change in a lot of reflex receptors, but the carotid chemoreceptor is one of them, mainly due to a low blood flow in the absence of shear stress at the level of the carotid body. So we've got a highly sensitive carotid body and a very low cardiac output here. Now when we look at this animal at rest, you can see the very high level of sympathetic activity here. When we do a total alpha blockade, we increase vascular conductance over 200%. It's substantial. Now, even at rest, when we inhibit just the carotid body in the intact animal, you can see this is accounting for about 25% of the total sympathetic restraint. And this stays just about the same in mild exercise in this animal. In the animal model, we think this is evidence that the carotid chemoreceptor is playing a role during exercise in health, in regulating sympathetic nerve activity and the distribution of blood flow. And in the heart failure animal, it's playing a role both at rest and during exercise, a significant role. What about in the human? Well, once again, we're going to deal with transient inhibition of the carotid chemoreceptor. And in this case, we used microneurography to measure at the perineal nerve, measure extracellular activity, sympathetic activity, and we looked at the effects of rhythmic arm exercise, rhythmic hand grip, and we superimposed transient hypoxia to find out exactly how long it would take to stimulate the carotid body, and then hyperoxia in healthy humans. Let me show you an example of that. So here's alveolar oxygen, CO2, our force output from the hand grip, and muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And right about here, we made the subject hypoxic here. And you can see with a latency of about 15 to 20 seconds, sympathetic nerve activity increase. No big deal. This is what you'd expect. Hypoxia stimulates the carotid chemoreceptor and cause an increase in sympathetic nerve activity. But what we wanted to know was, under normal rhythmic exercise conditions, was the tonic activity of the carotid chemoreceptor affecting sympathetic nerve activity? And to answer that, we'd have to inhibit the carotid chemoreceptor. And we can do that with hyperoxia. So here's the same variables: oxygen, CO2, hand grip force, blood pressure, and sympathetic nerve activity. Here's where we start the oxygen rising. There's no numbers here, but this goes up to about 600 millimeters of mercury, 100 to 600. And you can see once the end-tidal oxygen gets above about 200 millimeters of mercury, you can see this inhibition of sympathetic nerve activity. And we do several trials of this. That's the only problem with transient sorts of perturbations. They're transient. And so in order to quantify them, you have to do many and average them. And when we did that, you can see here's oxygen. We held ventilation constant because breathing has a big effect on sympathetic nerve activity. So we voluntarily control that and control CO2 throughout this. So all we changed was the oxygen. And you can see the sympathetic nerve activity here. Here's the control right in here. And here's the drop of about 30% in sympathetic nerve activity and the return to control. Mike Stickland, after he left us to go to the University of Alberta, has done some more studies, and they were just published in December of this year in the Journal of Physiology. And he showed that the same kind of protocol that he followed here not only caused the reduction in sympathetic nerve activity, but a 30% increase in limb vascular conductance and blood flow. So these are the only studies we've done to date in the animal, healthy, and in the heart failure animal, and these few studies in the human. But we think that based on these, we can postulate that in addition to these many factors that control sympathetic constraint of blood flow during exercise, that the carotid chemoreceptors contribute. And they contribute even more when the carotid chemoreceptor is upregulated, its sensitivity is upregulated in heart failure. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say about the carotid chemoreceptor, and kind of introduce that as a possible player in regulating distribution of blood flow during exercise in humans. Now here's a question that has been around for over a century. And it's not because of an absence of respiratory physiologists that we haven't solved this. They've been trying this over and over again, and for a long period of time, especially through the 60s and 70s and 80s, this was a very hot topic. Every national physiology meeting would have several papers on this and a great deal of argument. We haven't seen much on this in the past 20 years. I think we just all got discouraged. That the problem was that it was redundancy. So, for example, here it's the same players that we saw before. Okay, just a few added ones here that have been argued about. These are some of my favorites. I think they play some role. But these are the major contributors, just like they are for cardiovascular regulation. The problem here, and I'm going to concentrate on limb afferents here, this feedback. The problem here is for every experiment that showed that these contribute to exercise hyperpnea, there's another one that showed that they didn't. So, for example, in animal studies, you'd stimulate the limb electrically with no involvement of central command. You had just this operating, and you'd see a nice increase in ventilation. And then they'd do a spinal cord resection to block these afferents, stimulate the limb again, you'd see a nice increase in ventilation. In the human, the same thing happened, comparing intact with paraplegic humans. Even though you could only stimulate over a very, very small change in oxygen consumption or CO2 production, I think that's one of the problems, that the fact that the spinal cord was severed didn't seem to affect this. So we have to redesign the study, and people starting many years ago thought that. So we changed the question a bit. Do limb muscle afferents contribute to especially the ventilatory response, to rhythmic exercise in the human? Not to muscle ischemia, which is used to show that there is a metabolic reflex, but regular exercise. Does it contract? So the way this is done is to use voluntary rhythmic exercise, during which all major mechanisms are available, including central command and feedback. You want them there, rather than isolated muscle stimulation where central command is not in the picture at all. If you want to show that this has some relative influence, you've got to have all the major factors operating. And then the other thing to do is to remove or inhibit the signal, the existing tonic limb afferent input, rather than adding a non-physiologic stimulus like occluding blood flow to the muscle, something like that, which produces, I don't know what it produces. It stimulates all the receptors there plus a lot of pain, and although it's been used over and over again. So this is the idea, to combine voluntary rhythmic exercise with some way of inhibiting the normal existing tone from these afferents and see what effect it had on breathing and on blood pressure and on heart rate. And this has been done. Epidural lidocaine has been used. I'm still searching, but I found a dozen studies in humans over the years during cycling exercise. And what has been pretty consistent, what people saw there, is either no change or even an increase in heart rate and ventilation with a small reduction in blood pressure. So given these pretty consistent effects over all of these studies of epidural lidocaine, which satisfied these two conditions, this is the consensus. That with the fact that it didn't affect really the increase in exercise ventilation, or have little effect on heart rate, that central command is probably the major mechanism responsible for the ventilatory and heart rate response to exercise, whereas limb afferents contributed in a small way to the sympathetically induced vasoconstriction. That's currently, a couple of years ago, where we were. The limitations to this is that epidural lidocaine does more than just block the afferents. It has a substantial effect on the motor side, on the efferents. This means that the limb muscles are weakened. And we know from many Curare experiments that if you weaken the limb muscle, in order to achieve a given workload, you're going to have to recruit more motor units. If you're going to recruit more motor units, you're going to have to bring in more central motor command. So when you use epidural lidocaine to block the afferents, you're studying much more than just the effect of afferent blockade. You're studying an increased central command. So maybe that's explains why in some cases we saw an increase in heart rate with afferent blockade and a hyperventilation rather than the other way around, because we've done more than just block the afferents. Well, there is a way to get just at the afferents, and that's to use a different drug, intrathecal fentanyl, an opiate receptor agonist. And we know from the pioneering work of Mark Kaufman and his colleagues in the early 90s that these opiate agonists block most of the pressure response to isometric muscle contraction in the anesthetized animal when they inject it intrathecally. So this will block the pressure response. We know also that maximal voluntary contraction, limb muscle EMG, is unaffected by the use of fentanyl. So the strength of these muscles are intact, and there's effect just on the afferents and no effect on the efferents. The distribution of fentanyl was a major concern. If we're injecting it in the lumbar area and it reaches the medulla, then we're not testing just the effect of blocking the afferents. So we had to make sure that it didn't do that. And we did the usual things, the clinical things of cutaneous sensory analgesia up to the thoracic area that was detected. We saw no change in circulating levels. There was no fentanyl in the circulation. At rest, blood pressure, heart rate, ventilation did nothing. The ventilatory response to increasing levels of CO2 did not change. And we saw a trivial kind of response to arm exercise, which would bring us up to the cervical level at least. So we were pretty sure that when we injected this drug and kept the subject upright, that it was going no higher than the cervical level. So we had a block of afferents. I've seen this just 2 days ago confirmed now in another study, and last fall in another study from the Mayo Clinic. So with those three, and I think a fourth study Marcus did as well, we're pretty sure that at least in most subjects, there's a couple we saw that where we couldn't use them because there was a big effect on the CO2 response. So we think it's staying fairly local, at least no higher than the cervical level. What does it do when we block the afferents? Under normal steady state exercise, not isometric contractions, not ischemic limbs. Well, here's the heart rate response, rest, several levels of steady state exercise. Here's the mean arterial pressure. And you can see that there's an effect on heart rate across the range of exercise loads, and there's an effect on blood pressure. Substantially, in fact, it doesn't rise much at all until we get into very heavy exercise with the fentanyl blockade. So what we see here is a persistent reduction in heart rate and blood pressure, even in the face of substantial feedback from unloaded baroreceptors. This is steady state here now. So we've got lots of feedback here, and still we see this sustained reduction. So we think blocking the afferents must be a fairly significant contribution to the regulation of these two variables. What about breathing? Oh, and then I'm sorry, excuse me, Marcus did a study again. People don't stop working after they leave our laboratory, and he went and measured cardiac output and limb flow and found with a single leg kick, very light exercise, that cardiac output and limb blood flow were reduced as well. Now here's breathing. Here's ventilation over CO2 production, and here's end-tidal CO2 here. And here's the rest and the different workloads and the high workload here. And you can see that even at rest there was no effect on the control of breathing, but even at mild and all the way through exercise, but especially during the mild to moderate reason and a little less at the heavy exercise, you can see that the ventilation is down. There's substantial CO2 retention here. And despite that, the hypoventilation continues. So we concluded from this that the persistent hypoventilation during exercise occurred despite substantial increase in chemoreceptor feedback. And with these kinds of high levels of CO2, we'd expect both the peripheral and the central chemoreceptors to be extremely acid. And despite this feedback drive here, with the afferents blocked, this hypoventilation continues. So just like the circulatory response, we think that these are contributing significantly. Here was our conclusion. Muscle afferents via opiate receptor-sensitive pathways are essential to the normal cardioventilatory response to rhythmic exercise in healthy humans over a wide range of work intensity, especially through the moderate. And in heavy work, the effect was less than it was in moderate work, but certainly there in the steady state. This confirmed findings that we'd previously seen in time trial kind of exercise, but the workloads were different. Okay, but there's still a lot of questions remain with these limb muscle afferents. Most importantly, where are they acting? Well, one way, the first interpretation we had, we know the pathway from the muscle afferents through the dorsal horn of the spinal cord to the nucleus of the solitary tract to medullary cardiorespiratory neurons. So this might be what we blocked here, this pathway. But there might be other ways that this effect is occurring, that it could be affecting central command, an interactive effect, that at the level of the hypothalamus, if we're removing afferent input to here, it could affect breathing and cardiovascular variables at this level, or even at the level of spinal motor neurons. This is something we don't know. What does it take to trigger these afferents? Quite surprisingly to us, we saw that even at 50 to 100 watts of exercise, very mild exercise, no change in muscle lactate or pH or norepinephrine levels at this, you could see a substantial effect of blocking these afferents. So what does it take? Well, we usually think of metabol reflexes from the limbs being stimulated when oxygen supply is not meeting metabolic demand. Well, that wasn't the case here at all. These oxygen transport under these mild exercise conditions was fine, was adequate. I liked Kaufman's findings from the mid-90s in his cat model, where he stimulated the locomotor areas and he recorded from the type 3-4 afferents. And when the cat's contraction was at even less than 30% of maximum, with plenty high blood flow to that limb, not a static contraction, he saw these metaboreceptor afferents firing. Well, what's stimulating them? One possibility is the Frenchman Philippe Uzi's idea and data to show many years ago now that a vascular venous distension by itself can stimulate these afferents. But that's to be determined more than has been so far. But so this was a bit of a surprise. Relative contribution of feed forward versus feedback. Well, this is a tough one. When Tony Waldrop and Kaufman and others have studied this sort of thing in the anesthetized animal, what they find, oddly enough, in most cases is not a hyperadditive situation where both of these work at the same time, but hypoadditive. So if you're stimulating central command and then you add feedback to it, it reduces the effect of central command. So this isn't at all clear how these two major mechanisms operate. And then the final thing I wanted to discuss with you today is what does this have to do with limiting performance? And this is something that Marcus Amon and I have had. I usually haven't been very concerned with muscle fatigue. I'm more concerned with the lung. But the series of studies when Marcus was, and Lee Rumer as well, was a postdoc with us, just kind of got out of hand one after the other. And so we chased this a bit, and I'd like to tell you about it. So what the limb muscle afferents have to do with performance? Well, here's very briefly the concept that we're kind of after. And it's the concept of how peripheral fatigue might be linked to so-called central fatigue that Simon Gendivia is going to tell us about tomorrow morning, the central fatigue part. The evidence that we've got is that during an exercise, a time trial exercise, where the subjects get to choose what power output they want to use, when doing this time trial exercise with the muscle afferents blocked, subjects voluntarily increase the power output greater than the placebo, thereby incurring a 30% increase in quadriceps fatigue at end exercise. I think Marcus and I can remember these experiments very clearly when these very experienced cyclists would go into this time trial, and they're in the first minute or so of the time trial, and they're working at 30 to 40% power output of what they would do. They were in there 20 different times doing this, and they never let themselves do this. And you look over at them and say, how are you doing? They don't. Terrific. They needed this afferent feedback to find out just to create an optimal workload for themselves. So there's evidence that blocking these afferents certainly has a difference in how what the motor output is. So we think that the rate of muscle metabolite accumulation provides afferent feedback that inhibits central command in order to limit the amount of peripheral fatigue to a certain threshold. That's our hypothesis that we're working with some evidence for it. Okay, so with this in mind, what are the factors that are going to be operating if we block 3 to 4 afferents and look at endurance performance? Well, we think this will be 2 factors are operating here. On the one hand, if we breathe less, we'll become hypoxemic. This will increase the rate of muscle fatigue development and decrease performance. That's on the one hand, if we block the afferents. On the other hand, if we take away the feedback inhibition of central motor command by blocking these afferents, this will increase central motor command, and performance will be continued beyond the duration where normal fatigue threshold would be reached. So this would improve performance here, and this would decrease performance here. So this is what we did. We now did constant load exercise to exhaustion, placebo versus afferent blockade. And here's what happened. So, on the one hand, no big surprise given what we'd done in the previous year, afferent blockade reduced oxygen transport. Here's the trial at 318 watts here, above 80% max. You can see that we're hypoventilating, just like we did in those other studies. Here's the placebo, and here's afferent blockade. Our oxygen saturation is going to be substantially lower because our alveolar PO2 is lower. And the heart rate's lower. And we presume blood pressure would be lower, just like we found before. So, both from the point of blood flow and from the point of oxygen content, oxygen transport is reduced. Well, what about the other side of this? That if we block afferents from the limb, that now the inhibition of motor output will no longer be there from this afferent source. So this plots a very indirect estimate of central command. Quadriceps EMG here is a percent of what it was in the first minute of exercise. And you can see over the time trial in the placebo or intact state, this rise in EMG. That's what you'd expect. Okay, subjects trying harder all the time. Now, and at the end, as Marcus explained this morning, we twitched the femoral nerve supramaximally and measured the output, and you could see that the twitch fell by about a third. So this is the peripheral fatigue, the quadriceps fatigue that we had. Now with the afferent blockade, you can see that the motor output here, our indirect index of central motor command, increased substantially more in the latter phases of the exercise. We think this is the subject pushing himself, and at the end of this exercise, even though it was shorter, the fatigue was substantially greater. And these subjects had substantial problems with ambulation immediately after the test, that is, trying to get off the bike. They couldn't walk here. So substantial peripheral fatigue. And their performance decreased. Placebo, time to exhaustion, decreased about 20% or so. So we think this means that locomotor muscle afferents influence fatigue and endurance performance by providing an optimal cardioventilatory response to regulate oxygen transport, and they also provide feedback control to inhibit central motor command, we think, to preserve the muscle going past a certain level of peripheral fatigue. We don't know how this happens, why accumulating metabolites in a muscle, how, and the pressure in the muscle, how this is transferred to the central nervous system, or where within the central nervous system the decision is made to control motor control, or motor output. I've just seen some data very recently that in a patient with COPD, that in many patients with COPD that used the identical protocol that I just showed you. And when the afferents were blocked in these patients, their performance improved. So it's different strokes for different folks. The major limiting factor in a patient during exercise with COPD is the fact that they run into expiratory flow limitation because their airways close. If they run into expiratory flow limitation, they hyperinflate and they breathe at a very high lung volume. And they become extremely dyspneic and high work breathing, and this is why they quit. If you decreased the ventilation enough in these people, you reduce their flow limitation. And that's what happened. It made their ventilation much more efficient. They had no hyperinflation, and their performance improved. So that's quite different than you'd see in the normal individual. This study also confirms many of the factors that we've seen with the normal in terms of cardioventilatory regulation. And of course, just because we have a lot of doubters, especially in this audience, I'm glad you're here. Are these the only determinants of performance? Very unlikely. As many of these doubters would say, not bloody likely. Okay, and we recognize that. This is just one of the players. So, in conclusion, some of the new perspectives we think on the role of feedback in the control of breathing and cardiovascular function during rhythmic exercise in the human. First, locomotor muscle afferents contribute both to sympathetic and parasympathetic control in a highly significant manner at most exercise intensities, and again, rhythmic exercise. Secondly, carotid chemoreceptors contribute to sympathetic vasoconstrictor outflow and muscle blood flow regulation in the normal individual, even in mild exercise. And we don't know what changes the gain of that carotid chemoreceptor to see this kind of response. and certainly in disease states like heart failure, the contribution will be greater. And finally, our respiratory muscle metaboloreflex regulates blood flow distribution between the respiratory and the locomotor muscles. Thanks so much.